In this video, we're going to go through several hormones. I've struggled with figuring out how to best do this, and I'm not sure that this is the best way, but it's still what we're going to do. So we're going to talk about 25 different hormones as we go through this video. Okay, and so here are the outcomes for this video. Ultimately, what I'm going to expect you to know is the stimulus for each hormone, where that hormone is produced, the target for that hormone, and then ultimately what is the effect that hormone has on the body. All right, and so I've got two tables here that show you the hormones that we're going to go through. And so each column represents a different location where a hormone is released from. Remember that the hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary are actually produced by the hypothalamus. Okay, the parathyroid hormone actually comes from the parathyroid gland. Calcitonin comes from the thyroid gland, but just to make it so we didn't have multiple columns, I lumped them as endocrine glands. Then we've got the adrenal gland, as well as the reproductive system, the pancreas, the kidneys, and the digestive system. Now, this is in no way a comprehensive list of all the hormones that are floating around in your body, but these are the primary ones and ones that we will talk about throughout the semester. So let's start with growth hormone. Now, I want you to know that for each of these hormones, I've got a little drawing here that my illustrator did, and it should be able to convey the four things that I want you to know. So with growth hormone, the stimulus is when growth hormone releasing hormone activates the anterior pituitary. This causes the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone, and growth hormone pretty much targets everywhere, but specifically the bone, the muscle, and the liver. And ultimately what this does, this causes you to increase your height, increase muscle mass, as well as cause something called gluconeogenesis in the liver. Basically what that is that we take other compounds and we use them to form sugar. Okay, so it's the formation of new sugar. Next, we've got thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, so this is also stimulated by the release of a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. In this case, it's thyroid releasing hormone. Anterior pituitary is where this thyroid stimulating hormone is produced, and it targets the thyroid, and the thyroid then stimulates the production of thyroid hormones from the thyroid, specifically T3 and T4. Next, we've got follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. This is also produced in the anterior pituitary. It's stimulated by the release of something called gonadotropin releasing hormone. Sometimes you'll see that as GnRH. Okay, and then follicle stimulating hormone targets the ovaries and the testes. Ultimately, what it does is it causes the development of the follicle, which is a cell or group of cells that help egg cells mature, as well as spermatogenesis, or the development of sperm cells. Similarly, we have luteinizing hormone. And so luteinizing hormone is also stimulated by GnRH. It's produced and released from the anterior pituitary. It also targets the ovaries and the testes, but they have slightly different functions. So luteinizing hormone causes ovulation to occur, whereas in males, this causes the production of testosterone. And then finally, I think this is the last one, we've got ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. Again, it's stimulated by the release of a hormone from the hypothalamus called corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH. ACTH is produced by the anterior pituitary. This targets the adrenal cortex. That's why the name is what it is. Okay, and this is the outside or the outer layer of the adrenal gland. And ultimately, this stimulates the release of, or the production of, cortisol. Then we've got prolactin. Okay, prolactin is stimulated by low levels of dopamine. Okay, dopamine actually inhibits the production of prolactin, so when women have low levels, prolactin is released. It's produced in the anterior pituitary, and it targets the mammary glands. Ultimately, what this does is this causes milk to be produced. It's important to know that it's the milk production, not the milk release. Oxytocin, on the other hand, plays a role with milk as well from women. And so oxytocin is stimulated by a couple of things. So when a woman's cervix is stretched during labor and delivery, as well as a suckling or even a crying baby. Okay, oxytocin is produced in the hypothalamus, but if you remember from a previous video, it's stored in the posterior pituitary. So ultimately, that's where it's released from. Okay, so it targets both the uterus and the mammary glands. And the effects is that it causes uterine contractions as well as the release of milk. So prolactin causes the production of milk, oxytocin causes the release of milk. And then the other hormone that's released from the posterior pituitary is vasopressin, or antidiuretic hormone. Okay, this hormone is produced or released when the plasma osmolarity is high, so we have high concentration of salt. Okay, it's produced in the hypothalamus, released from the posterior pituitary. This hormone targets the kidneys. Okay, the kidneys are involved in water reabsorption, and so when we release vasopressin, what happens is water is reabsorbed. This also contributes a little bit to vasoconstriction, but what this does is it actually decreases urine volume and allows that water that would have been turned into urine to be brought back into the bloodstream. Okay, so now we're going to transition to some different locations. So we're going to talk real quick about thyroid hormones. Okay, so as we talked about just a moment ago, thyroid hormone is stimulated by the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, okay, produced in the thyroid. And this targets most cells in the body. And ultimately, what it does, or what these thyroid hormones do, is that they increase metabolic rate. Some people that are overweight, the reason that they're overweight is because their thyroid's not producing thyroid hormone, which causes a reduction in metabolic rate. Next, we've got parathyroid hormone. Okay, this is stimulated by low blood calcium. Okay, unsurprisingly, this is produced in the parathyroid gland. And what it does is it targets the bones, kidneys, and small intestine because all three of these locations can help increase blood calcium. And so what happens is parathyroid hormone causes calcium to be released from the bone. It causes the kidneys to release or to produce vitamin D, which helps with calcium reabsorption. And it also targets the small intestine, which will help pull calcium out of the small intestine and into the bloodstream. Now, on the flip side, we have calcitonin, and calcitonin basically does the exact opposite. Calcitonin is stimulated when we have high levels of calcium in our bloodstream. It's released by the by the thyroid gland. Okay, it targets the bone cells and the kidneys, and what happens is it causes these bone cells to take calcium up, and it causes the kidneys to excrete calcium. Okay, so as a result, we're getting rid of, or we're reducing the amount of calcium in our blood. Next, we've got cortisol. Okay, as we mentioned a moment ago, this is stimulated by the release of ACTH. Okay, it's also stimulated by stressful situations or when blood glucose is lower than normal. Okay, this is produced in the adrenal cortex, which, as we mentioned a moment ago, is the outer layer of the adrenal gland. Okay, cortisol targets liver, fat, and muscle, and the reason it does that is because we're trying to increase blood glucose. At the same time, one of the things that cortisol does is it also suppresses or reduces the activity of the immune system. Okay, this allows energy to be directed towards fighting off some sort of stress. Next, we have aldosterone. Aldosterone is stimulated by low blood pressure and stimulated by the release of a hormone that we'll talk about later called renin. It's also stimulated when potassium concentration is high or sodium concentration is low. Usually, those two things go hand in hand. Now, when we're talking about potassium concentration or sodium concentration, we're talking about those concentrations in the extracellular fluid, so outside of the cell, either in the bloodstream or in the interstitial fluid. Okay, this is produced also in the adrenal cortex. This targets the kidneys, and what happens is this helps with water reabsorption. It causes potassium to be excreted or get removed. It also causes us to release a hormone called ADH or vasopressin, which we talked about. Ultimately, this will lead to increased blood pressure. Then next we have epinephrine. Now, epinephrine can act as both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. And for this class, we generally just think of it as a hormone, whereas norepinephrine we think of as a neurotransmitter, but both of them have similar responses. Okay, or similar functions. So epinephrine is released when we have some sort of stress, strong emotions. This is a sympathetic response, or a hormone that's released in response to a sympathetic response. Okay, so like if you see a bear, you see a shark, that sort of thing, you're scared. It's produced by the adrenal medulla. The medulla is the inner part of the adrenal cortex or the adrenal gland. This targets the heart, the blood vessels, and the muscle cells, ultimately causing increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, and increased metabolism. From there, we're going to get into the reproductive hormones. And so here we have estrogen. Okay, estrogen is primarily found in women, biological females, but it's also found in biological males. And so the stimulus, as we mentioned a little while ago, is luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. This targets generally the ovaries, okay, and so are produced in the ovaries and targets the brain, the bones, and the reproductive system. Ultimately, this causes the development of female sex characteristics, okay, and those are characteristics that we use to identify women, as opposed to male sex characteristics, which we use to identify males, and we'll talk about that in more detail when we get to the reproductive system. Ultimately, the estrogen also helps thicken or develop the lining of the uterus, or the endometrium. From there, we're going to have testosterone, and so testosterone and estrogen are kind of the same thing. One generally works with biological males, one works with biological females. Testosterone is stimulated by luteinizing hormone. Okay, it's produced in the testicles. All right, and it targets, just like estrogen, the brain, the bones, and the reproductive system. Ultimately, testosterone does a few things, including, but not limited to, the development of male sex characteristics. It can also lead to growth and things like that. Next, we have progesterone. And so progesterone, again, primarily a biological female hormone. So this is stimulated by a surge of luteinizing hormone that we'll talk about in the reproductive system. Okay, so this is produced by something called the corpus luteum of the ovaries. Okay, as I mentioned a little while ago, we have something called a follicle that helps these egg cells develop. That follicle will rupture and release the egg cell, and then that follicle will turn into the corpus luteum, where it releases progesterone. Okay, the progesterone targets the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus, as well as the mammary glands. Ultimately, this causes the uterus to get ready for possible implantation. It helps maintain that uterine lining in case implantation of fertilized egg occurs. It prevents lactation from occurring. So in this case, it's an inhibitory hormone, and it also helps with development of the breasts. Next, we have human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. This is the hormone that's used to determine, or that pregnancy tests use to give you an idea of whether or not a woman is pregnant. Okay, so the stimulus is implantation of an embryo or fertilized egg. Okay, this is produced by the placenta, and it targets the corpus luteum of the ovaries. Ultimately, the job is to maintain this corpus luteum. Okay, this is a hormone that biological males do not produce, but biological females do. There's a quick little anecdote. There was a guy that was playing college football several years ago. He had a drug test for marijuana. He had been smoking marijuana. He didn't want to get busted, so he had his girlfriend give the urine sample for him. And he was told, congratulations, you're pregnant. You're also fined, or I guess they don't fine college kids, but suspended, kicked off the team, whatever. Okay, and so they knew that it wasn't his because men don't produce HCG. Next, we have inhibin. Inhibin is one of the few hormones that we talk about that's actually an inhibitory hormone. So this is stimulated, or the release of inhibin is caused by high levels of FSH. It's produced in both the ovaries and the testes. It targets the anterior pituitary to inhibit the release of FSH. From there, we're going to transfer over to the pancreas, and we're going to talk about two hormones with the pancreas. So we've got insulin, which is stimulated by high blood glucose. Okay, this is produced in the pancreas, and what happens is the pancreas releases insulin. It targets both muscle, liver, and fat. And what this does is this increases glucose uptake into all of those places. Ultimately, this reduces blood glucose. So we want insulin, or we want sugar or glucose to go in the muscle cells so we can use it to create ATP. We want sugar to go in the liver where we can store it and use it later. And then it also goes into the fat if we've got too much sugar. And so then sugar can turn to fat. Kind of the opposite would be glucagon. Glucagon is stimulated by low levels of blood glucose, also released or produced by the pancreas. This targets the liver. And so what happens is glucagon goes into the liver, and basically what happens is you have these big chains of glucose that are stored in the liver. Glucagon causes the breakdown of those chains, which are called glycogen, into smaller glucose molecules, which ultimately causes there to be a higher level of glucose in the bloodstream. Next, we're going to talk about the kidneys. So we've got erythropoietin, or EPO. Okay, this is stimulated by low oxygen in the blood. Right? It's produced by the kidneys, and what it does is it targets the bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. Okay, the reason that we produce more red blood cells when we have low oxygen is because red blood cells are how we carry a vast majority of the oxygen in our bloodstream. And so if we've got low oxygen, we'll create more blood cells to hold on to even more oxygen. Next, we've got calcitriol, or vitamin D. Okay, so this is stimulated by the parathyroid hormone when we have low calcium in our bloodstream. This is produced in the kidneys as well, and it targets the small intestines, the bones, and the kidneys. And ultimately, what's happening is we're increasing the absorption of calcium into the small intestine, okay? And we're reabsorbing calcium in the kidneys, okay? Basically, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get calcium from the kidneys and the small intestine back into the bloodstream. Then we've got renin. So renin is very important when it comes to blood pressure. Okay, renin is released when we have low blood pressure or we have reduced blood flow into our kidneys. Okay, so it's produced by the kidneys and it targets the liver. And the reason it targets the liver is that it converts something called angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, which we'll talk about during the urinary system. Ultimately, it starts a cascade of events or a domino effect that will lead to an increase in blood pressure. Finally, we're going to end with the digestive hormones or some of the digestive hormones. So we've got gastrin. So gastrin is stimulated, or the release of gastrin is stimulated when we have proteins in our stomach or our stomach is distended or stretched out. Okay, and so as a result, the stomach and the duodenum release gastrin, and this targets the stomach. And ultimately what this does is this causes the stomach to release gastric acid or hydrochloric acid to break down those proteins, to break down whatever it is that's in our stomach. And so then next we have secretin. So secretin is stimulated when we have low pH or high acidity in the small intestine. Okay, it's produced in the duodenum. And ultimately it targets both the stomach and the pancreas. Okay, it causes the stomach to stop producing or at least reduce the production of gastric acid or that hydrochloric acid. And it causes the pancreas to stimulate bicarbonate release. Bicarbonate is a base. Bases neutralize acid. And so that reduces the pH, reduces the acidity in the small intestine. The stomach can stand or can handle having low pH or high acidity because it's got a lining that protects it. The small intestine does not. And so we want to basically protect our small intestine. We do that through the help of secretin. And then we've got cholecystokinin or CCK, kind of a fun word to say. Okay, this is stimulated by having fat in our small intestine. Okay, so the small intestine, the duodenum, the jejunum release CCK, and ultimately what CCK does is it targets the pancreas, the gallbladder, and the stomach. And these are all going to work together to break down fats. Okay, so the pancreas releases digestive enzymes that help break down fat. The gallbladder releases bile, which allows fat to be broken down and emulsified. And then it causes the stomach to slow things down so we can break down these fats. All right, so with that, can we identify hormones from the anterior pituitary, the posterior pituitary, the pancreas, and the reproductive systems? And talk about their production site, what stimulates their release, what they target, and what their effects are. And I know that there were about 30 of them, so that's a lot, but see which ones you understand. You know, some of these we've probably already discussed in class.